the president of Syria, who I essentially put there, is doing a phenomenal job. He's a rough guy. He's not a choir boy. A choir boy couldn't do it. But Syria is coming together, really coming together well. And thus far, he's been very good to the Kurds. Yeah.
Thank you,
Mr. President, what's your message to the Iranian people after 2 rounds of talks with them? Do you have any message to the Iranian people?
The Iranian people in Iran or people here?
People in Iran.
They better negotiate a fair deal. You know, the people of Iran are a lot different than the leaders of Iran. And it's very, very sad situation. But 32,000 people were killed over a relatively short period of time. They were going to hang 800, 2 weeks ago, hang, some by crane. They lift them up with a tall crane, and they play them around the square. They were going to hang 837 people. And I gave them the word, if you hang one person, even one person, that you're going to be hit right then and there. I wasn't waiting 2 weeks and negotiating. And they gave up the hanging. They didn't hang 837. Supposedly, they didn't hang anybody. But no, I feel very badly for the people of Iran. They've lived in hell. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President, you mentioned multiple times foreign influence over the Supreme Court. Do you have evidence of that? And if not, will you investigate that?
You're going to find out.
What alternatives are you going to put into place in your relationship with Europe, and also those tariffs that have been called illegal? How they're going to go impact the relationship with Russia, that you sanctions?
Well, I want Europe to strengthen up. Europe has gone woke. Europe is not recognizable when you go into so many places. Not all countries. You look at Hungary. You look at Poland, Czech, Slovakia. There are some countries that have gone very much the opposite. Some really, and some others. But Europe has to be strong, and they become soft and not recognizable. You go into some of the countries, I don't want to be specific, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about, and they're not recognizable. They become, the environmentalists have taken over. They've got windmills destroying their fields and their beautiful meadows and their oceans, and they're paying a fortune. Now, Europe has to get smart. Europe's getting killed on two things, energy and immigration. And if they don't solve both of them fast, Europe is not the same place. Yeah, please.
Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, are you surprised in particular by their decision today? And do you regret nominating them?
I don't want to say whether or not I regret. I think their decision was terrible. Yeah. I think it's an embarrassment to their families. You want to know the truth? The two of them. Yeah.
Specifically on that $2,000 tariff check.
Mr. President.
I didn't call you.
You didn't call me?
Yeah, Mr. President, to be clear, do you believe at the end of implementing these new tariff tools, the tariff rate and tariffs will ultimately be higher than they currently are?
Potentially higher.
How much higher?
It depends, whatever we want them to be. But we want them to be fair for other countries. And, you know, we have some countries that have treated us really badly for years, and it's going to be high for them. And we have other countries that have been very good, and it's going to be very reasonable for them. Yeah.
Specifically on the tariffs question, on the $2,000.
I didn't call you.
Mr. President, thank you, Mr. President. Do you have any plans to travel to India for the Quad Summit, and how do you think your relationship with India is right now?
I think my relationship with India is fantastic, and we're doing trade with India. India pulled out of Russia. You know, India was getting its oil from Russia, right? And they pull way back at my request because we want to settle that horrible war where 25,000 people are dying every month. And my relationship with Prime Minister Modi is, I would say, great. I also stopped a war between India and Pakistan, as you know. There were 10 planes we shot down. That war was going and probably going nuclear. And just yesterday, the Prime Minister of Pakistan said President Trump saved 35 million lives by getting them to stop. And I did it largely with tariffs. I said, look, you're going to fight, that's fine, but you're not going to do business with the United States, and you're going to pay a 200% tariff, each country. And they called up and they said, we have made peace. Okay? I just want to thank you all. Look, great certainty has been brought back to the economy of the United States and actually the economy of the world, because we generate so much in the world. We're the biggest in the world, and we're now the strongest by far. We were a country that was dead 1.5 years ago. Now we have the hottest country in the world. We're going to keep it that way. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
You have been listening, of course, to President Trump live there at the White House press briefing room, talking about what has been now our top story, not only of Friday, but really for the week overall, as the U.S. Supreme Court struck down President Trump's global tariffs. I will say some of the headlines coming from that press conference, he spoke for over half an hour or so. He said alternatives will be used to replace rejected tariffs. He also said all the trade deals are on. We're just doing it differently. He talked about, too, a 10% tariff across the board. And he says, I think starting 3 days from now. He talked about the refunds, which is something the Supreme Court did not weigh in on, how it has to be litigated for a couple of years. And he continues to go on. I do want to welcome you to Bloomberg Businessweek Daily on this Friday, what is turning out to be a very busy Friday. I'm Carol Massar. Tim Stenovec is off today, but joining me here in our studio is our own Emily Graffeo. She follows the market. She follows the credit markets. But again, talking about these tariffs, it sounds like the president's going to find his own way forward here.
And you look at how the market reacted, Carol. Stocks rebounded. The NASDAQ 100 is now up about 1%, with Trump even talking about using alternatives. But we also saw stocks rallying even this morning when the Supreme Court did rule that those tariffs exceeded the president's authority.
Yeah, that ruling coming out just after the market opened, it was really kind of fascinating to see, and it really shifted kind of our focus here. But you do have a market right now where you do have the S&P 500 up about 0.6 of a percentage point, pretty much hovering near its highs of the session. Same story for the NASDAQ 100. I do also want to point out that the president talked about foreign influence on the Supreme Court. He said, in my opinion, the court has been swayed. So covering a lot of ground. He talked about a few other issues, too, in terms of the Middle East. I'm going to tell you that over the next 60 minutes, we're going to be all in on this, on that Supreme Court decision, what it really means, what are the president's or might be the president's next step when it comes to what is a key part of his platform. We're also going to get into what we thought was going to be our top story on this Friday, and this has to do with U.S. economic data that delivered what some say is a messy message of both hotter than expected inflation and slower than anticipated growth. And then, Emily, we've got to talk about Iran. I mean, we have seen so many different narratives play out this week in markets, but geopolitical concerns is certainly one of them.
That's right. You take a look at what oil's doing, you can definitely see, even if stocks brushing off geopolitical concerns and volatility, oil is where that action is happening. We have a lot, Carol.
It's a lot of big issues. It's a lot coming out of Washington, so we're going to get to all of that over the next 60 minutes and more. But first up, folks, you want to know what's going on in the Friday trade session. So let's get to it with Nora Melinda. She's in for Charlie Pellet.
Well, we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. We have U.S. stocks ticking higher while bonds hold losses, along with the dollar, after President Donald Trump pledged to defend his sweeping global tariffs program after the Supreme Court struck it down. Take a look at the S&P 500. We see it up about 0.7%. The NASDAQ Composite Index currently up about 1%. And that blue chip Dow Jones Industrial Average ticking higher about 0.4%. Take a look at the volatility in the market, and we see the VIX Index just below that 19 handle. The yield on the benchmark 10-year Treasury at 4.1%. The policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury yield at 3.5%. Taking a look at oil, we see West Texas Intermediate crude currently lower by about 0.2%. That is trading at $66.32. Also keeping an eye on gold, we see it up about 1.5%, topping that $5,000 key level. And taking a look at Bitcoin, we've got that in focus, down about 0.2%. And keeping an eye, up 1.3% for that Bitcoin there. We do see individual movers, Walmart shares declining for a fourth straight day. That's after HSBC cut the recommendation on the company to hold from buy. The analyst saying that Walmart's fourth quarter results were solid. With volumes growing and e-commerce performance strong, the outlook for 2026 is quote-unquote surprisingly weak, given solid trends. And Live Nation shares climbing after reporting revenue for the fourth quarter that topped the average analyst estimate. Analysts are positive about the company's fourth full-year forecast and strength in its concerts business. And lastly, Newmont shares falling. That's after the company said it expects to produce less bullion this year, partly due to planned upgrades at some of its managed mines and lower production at 2 ventures jointly owned with Barrick Mining. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nora Melinda, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It is indeed. All right, Nora, thank you so much. Carol Massar along with Emily Graffeo. Tim is off today. All right, let's stay with what is really our top story on this Friday and for the week overall. The U.S. Supreme Court, as you know, saying President Trump exceeded his authority and struck down the president's sweeping global tariffs, undercutting his signature economic policy and delivering his biggest legal defeat since he returned to the White House. President Trump weighed in. As you know, we just came off of it, but he began that press conference from the White House press briefing room talking about kind of his disappointment, I should say, with the nation's highest court.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. I'd like to thank and congratulate Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh for their strength and wisdom and love of our country, which is right now very proud of those justices. When you read the dissenting opinions, there's no way that anyone can argue against them. There's no way. But other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones that the court incorrectly rejected.
All right, and some of those alternatives we just heard from the president in that live press event. That is, of course, President Trump in the last hour from the White House. Meantime, we've also seen the New York Times coming out saying that the president does plan to invoke new trade authorities after the ruling, considering new across-the-board tariff on trading partners. And we talked about his plan that maybe in 3 days we see a 10% tariff across the board. All right, let's get more on the significance of that Supreme Court decision. We head to D.C. Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr was listening to President Trump as well. He is in the Bloomberg News Bureau in the nation's capital. Greg, it's a big day. We kind of expected this outcome, but I don't know that we expected the decision today. But exactly what was the decision and the significance of it? Walk us through it.
So the significance is that the pillar of the tariffs that the president has been imposing over the last year does not give him tariff authority, the Supreme Court said. It knocked out more than half of the tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed since returning to office. The Supreme Court said that statute, which gives the president certain powers during economic emergencies, does not include the tariff power. And that was sort of the fundamental dividing point. The dissenting justices said, yes, it does. Now, as the president suggested, there are other tariff authorities. He's going to try to invoke those as much as he can. But those do tend to be more cumbersome, more limited. And so we'll see just how much he's able to replace the tariffs that have been struck down.
Where does this go next? Is this ever coming back to the Supreme Court? Or are the next steps here really going just back to lower courts?
It's really going to be the lower courts. There will be big fights over refunds in that press conference. The president said he expects that to be litigated over a matter of years. It's not yet clear what argument the administration has against refunds for the $170 billion that have been paid in these tariffs under this law, but it sounds like they are prepared to at least make some of them. So that will be a big fight. And then we may well have future fights over these other laws, including the one that the president said he is going to use to impose that 10% global tariff. That's a more limited authority that is supposed to extend only for 150 days. There may be questions about the exact parameters of what Donald Trump can do under that law.
I am curious too, Greg, about what the president said about foreign influence of the Supreme Court. And he said, in my opinion, the court has been swayed. What is your read on that? And what is he maybe insinuating?
It's a bit of a head scratcher. The president, of course, has always said that these tariffs are paid by foreign countries, not by U.S. importers. Well, U.S. importers have made very clear in suing over these things that they're the ones who are paying for them. And so that is perhaps what he's alluding to there. Certainly no evidence of that I've seen in the opinion that it was anything other than their interpretation of what the law and the Constitution require.
I'm wondering, this decision, the 6-3 decision, what kind of clarity does it give us about just how much power the executive branch has? Because, of course, right after the decision, we have Trump coming out and saying, floating another 10% global tariff.
Yeah, well, so kind of two halves to the answer. One half is the president is right. He has other authorities, and the Supreme Court didn't say you couldn't put in place any tariffs at all. You just can't do it using this law that the president has used so far up until now to basically impose tariffs for any reason at all that he wants. So in that sense, it's narrow. But the court also, in a section that was joined by two Trump appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, and also the Chief Justice John Roberts, talked about Congress's tariff authority, Congress's taxing authority, and said that unless Congress has clearly handed over that power to the president, we're not just going to assume that the president can do something. There are actual limits to what he can do, and the court invoked some of the opinions it used to roll back, to trim, to knock out some of Joe Biden's initiatives. So the court, at least, three Republican-appointed members of the court, as well as the liberals, were trying to send the message that, hey, we are putting some real limits on what this president, like all presidents, can do.
Yeah, and I love that question from Emily and what you just said, Greg, because I do think about, what the president, we've talked so much about the expansion of the executive branch and of presidential powers in the second term of a Trump White House. And it does seem like this president, many would say, can do just about anything, right? We've seen a Congress that's very quiet, a Republican-led Congress. But having said that, how do you read the tea leaves on a Supreme Court that has been seen to be very sympathetic and maybe even political, some would say, to President Trump specifically and his policies to make this ruling? Or did they not really have any choice based on it was pretty black and white in terms of the law?
Well, certainly important to emphasize, as you alluded to, that over the past year, the Supreme Court has let Donald Trump do an awful lot of things that he wanted to do. Most of them only on a temporary basis, letting him fire people, letting him not spend money, letting him end immigration programs. And, that's still a reality that the court is being pretty deferential to Donald Trump in a lot of areas. But these were totally different legal questions. As I said, the Constitution says the tariff power is Congress's, and the court was looking at this case as a separation of powers case, unlike the other ones that it had been dealing with. And this is a place where, from the court's perspective, Donald Trump just went too far.
All right, got to leave it there. Greg, thank you so much. I know a busy day for you. So glad we could get some time with you. Greg Stohr, he's, of course, the Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter joining us from our D.C. bureau. We're going to stay with this story, and we touched on some of this, certainly from the press conference with the president there at the White House, but also with Greg. And we want to get into maybe a little bit more of what we are hearing from that press conference, after that press conference, what's going on inside the White House. And for that, we want to get to Bloomberg News White House correspondent Kate Sullivan, who just ran to the microphone there on the north lawn of the White House. Kate, good to have you here. You were in the room. Tell us a little bit about what that felt like on what is certainly got to be, I think safe to say, the president's got to be feeling a big defeat with what is a major policy of his second term here in the White House.
Absolutely. So we just wrapped that press conference and we saw a very defiant Trump at the podium. There's a lot to unpack from that press conference, but some of the top lines are the president said that he would be signing new orders to impose tariffs to replace some of these tariffs. He talked about using Section 122 to impose a 10% across-the-board tariff. Also talked about Section 301, which applies to unfair trade practices. I asked the president about whether this meant that he would now be asking Congress to take additional action when it comes to tariffs, and if he'd spoken to Leader Thune about this. I thought it was really interesting. He said, I don't need to. I'm not going to do that because I don't need to. I felt like the top line from the president was, we're still going to have tariffs, but they're just going to look a bit different. And I thought it was interesting. He talked a lot about certainty. He kept repeating the word certainty, saying that for a very long time we were waiting to see how this decision was going to play out, what was going to happen, and we were living in sort of a limbo period, the White House was. And now at least they know what has happened, they have some certainty, and they think that that should inspire some confidence and really sort of now dictates how they're going to move forward with this.
When Trump does move forward, there's a great piece on the Bloomberg terminal right now, the Quick Take, about just all of Trump's legal options that he has after the Supreme Court said his tariffs
are illegal. What will those look like in practice? Are the tariffs that Trump would potentially introduce under, these new laws going to be as expansive as what we had seen last year post-Liberation Day?
There were several reporters in the room who were trying to press for more specifics on what exactly this would look like, what exactly the rates would be. The president kept saying, I can do whatever I want. So we don't have those specifics yet. We are, obviously this has just happened. The White House is still responding to this. We heard a lot of broad top lines from the president today about how he's feeling about it, what he's going to do, but there are still a lot of questions. And he was asked, for example, about the refunds, whether the administration now needs to refund all of the billions of dollars in revenue that they've collected from the tariffs. And he said the court didn't weigh in on that. He sounded frustrated that they did not weigh in on that particular part. And so we still don't know. He said that would be playing out in courts. And like a lot of this, I think this is still going, there's still a lot of unresolved questions, and this is still going to be playing out for quite some time.
Kate, looking at section 301 and 232, 232 is national security reasons for maybe imposing tariffs. 301 seems to give, the section 301 seems to give the president a lot of leeway to impose tariffs. I mean, it sounds like he still has a lot of levers that he can pull if he deems that it's important for the United States, national security or otherwise.
Absolutely. I think national security has been
all within the laws, I guess what I would say, all within the law.
All within the law, yes. The president has been talking about how tariffs are critical to national security. That's been a key part of his argument. I think we still have to see, how this is going to play out, what he's going to do next. But definitely, I think another part of this is how is this going to affect the trade deals that have already been struck? He talked about that briefly in the press briefing room today, saying that some of them are going to have to be reopened. Some of them are going to have to be renegotiated, but that a lot of them can still stand. He was asked specifically about India. He said India is the same, that will stay the same. But I think there are still a lot of questions about how exactly he's going to use, when it comes to these particular sections that he laid out, how that's going to be implemented in practice.
All right, good stuff. Kate, so appreciate it. Our Kate Sullivan there on the North Lawn of the White House. She's Bloomberg News White House correspondent, just coming off that White House press briefing with the president, obviously dealing a lot with that Supreme Court decision when it comes to tariffs. We're going to get back to this with our own Mike McKee and others in just a moment. But the other thing, which is another big issue, has to do with geopolitical concerns. The president talked a little bit about certainly the Middle East in that press event. So we want to get to Iran. The U.S., as we know, has deployed a vast array of forces in the region, including 2 aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and refueling tankers. So that has prompted some speculation that the president is planning a campaign aimed at ousting the Iranian regime. So let's get into that conversation with Tony Capaccio. He's Bloomberg News, Pentagon, and national security reporter. He, too, is in our D.C. News Bureau. Tony, give us some perspective. This military presence, it feels like it's a pretty big buildup, but you understand this. Tell us what's going on. Is the U.S. just looking to appear threatening, or is it a country that is threatening and maybe even ready to go to war with Iran?
I think we are threatening, but to put this in context, in the buildup in 2003, there were like 5 aircraft carriers and 200,000 troops surged to the area, basically to force Saddam Hussein to allow the UN and weapons inspectors to continue their search for weapons of mass destruction. So that's a benchmark I look at. Obviously, we don't have the troops involved here, but the ships, there were more ships, I'm pretty sure, in 2003 than now. But this is a significant buildup. Trump, I was told by a former CENTCOM official who follows this closely that Trump does have some credibility with Iran in terms of past actions. He assassinated Soleimani, the head of the IRGC in January of 2020, and then we struck their nuclear facilities last June. So in Iran's eyes, according to this official, Trump does have some credibility. When he says something about action, Iran, there's a track record there that Iran has to respect. Mm-hmm. Now, the other side of the coin is this. I don't think there's imminent action here. Trump's speaking out of several sides of his mouth right now. He has not prepared the public for the why of this. Why is the United States potentially going to get involved in the third war of choice
since 1991 in the Middle East. He's vacillated on his reasons. I think as a president, he needs to lay out a case, good or bad or ugly, what the case is. Because citizens are going to scratch their heads and why are we doing this? Now, the other thing is, too, forces, right now there are 6 destroyers there. They're armed with Tomahawk missiles. There's probably a submarine there that can carry like 154 Tomahawks in the region. But they have limited strike capability. They're not deep penetrating weapons. You would have to bring the B-2 bombers back, reprise what they did in June for deep strike capabilities. Mm-hmm. So that's lacking. Mm-hmm. Those are definitely going to play out if it does happen. And the other thing, too, is destroyers, they're a presence, but they're not deep penetrators. And the airplanes, the F-35s that we would send in, mm-hmm. they have limited capability in terms of bombs. They're not bunker buster dropping airplanes. So this would be a large, massive campaign if, in fact, we tried to do anything effective.
The other thing is, Tony, and I think about this, Emily, too, mm-hmm. this is a president who would love the Nobel Peace Prize. And going to war is not something that would make somebody, many people would say, is the way to get something like that.
I mean, Tony,
Carol,
tell us about the why.
Well, let me address your one point, the Nobel Prize thing, because I was thinking about this.
Yeah.
Would a president, the last weekend of the Olympics, launch a massive campaign against Iran for no apparent reason?
Yeah.
Screwing up the Olympics, the end of the Olympics, and then claiming, I want the Nobel Peace Prize for this.
I know, right? Like sometimes I feel like I'm crazy, but I feel like you've got to kind of take all of this in because it definitely plays out. Emily, I know you want to jump in here.
Well, Tony, what is your best guess as to answering the question of the why? What is the president's intention here?
The only thing I can think of that could be sold to the public is weakening the regime in terms of their abilities to launch proxy group attacks against U.S. forces in the Middle East and elsewhere. I mean, going after their ballistic missiles, nations are entitled to have ballistic missiles. That's part of as a national defense force. That's not an imminent threat against the United States. Proper. It is possibly against U.S. troops in the region, but going after their missile systems, their conventional missile systems, is that a reason to go to war for the third time since 1991 against Iran? Their nuclear program. If you're Joe Sixpack or you drink Chardonnay, you remember last June he obliterated their nuclear program.
Yeah.
Why are we doing this again? You need to explain it to the public. Plus, there's no allies on our side this time. The Saudis are not allowing us to use their airspace. The United Arab Emirates begrudgingly because we have a base there. But you need to explain why you're doing this.
Right. I thought I heard Caroline Leavitt say, I was listening to a podcast and they had a little clip, but I thought they said that, Iran has done some buildup since that. And so the U.S. maybe is entitled to go in. Forgive me if I'm not getting that right. Hey, one last thing, Tony. What are you kind of watching? I think we're all going into this weekend wondering what could happen.
I don't think it'll be this weekend.
Okay.
You got the Ford, and the Ford's not there yet. That was a big Trump card in terms of lowercase t, by the way, Trump. In terms of a second carrier, you need the carrier on station off of Israel in the Med to provide air defense coverage to Israel, basically, because Iran is going to retaliate. The forces that we're putting in place there are basically to counter Iranian retaliation in terms of long-range missile strikes against Israel and other assets. The Ford's battle group provides missile defense destroyers. Mm-hmm. They have airplanes there that could provide non-stealthy coverage against Iranian drone attacks. So you need those capabilities there in the region for a viable viable force to basically counter Iranian retaliation.
I just want to go to a bar, grab a glass of wine, and just talk with you about all this stuff because it's incredible, your knowledge and understanding of it. Tony, thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Yeah, so appreciate it. Tony Capaccio, he's Bloomberg News, Pentagon, and national security reporter. I'm Carol Massar, along with Emily Graffeo. Not a quiet Friday.
It's not. We have markets moving, Carol, but stocks are rallying amid all of this geopolitical volatility, uncertainty on tariffs. Equity investors are like, let's just keep on buying this market. It's
kind of amazing, and I feel like we've seen this movie before. All right, let's get an update on the trade on this Friday, folks. Let's head on over to Norma Melinda. She's in for Charlie Pellet.
Hey, Carol, we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. We see U.S. stocks rising higher. This is after President Donald Trump pledged to defend his sweeping global tariff program after the Supreme Court struck it down. Taking a look at the broader market, we see the S&P 500 up about 0.6%. The Nasdaq Composite Index rising about 0.8% higher. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average up about 0.4%. We got some economic data out this morning. The U.S. economy grew less than expected at the end of last year due to a record-long government shutdown, consumer spending, and trade. Also, new home sales in the United States picked up at the end of the year as builders' liberal use of sales incentives and slightly lower financing costs encourage buyers. Taking a look at the volatility in the market, we see the VIX hanging just below that 19 handle. The yield on the benchmark 10-year Treasury just below 4.1%. And the policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury yield at 3.5%. Taking a look at oil, we see West Texas Intermediate crude currently lower by about 0.1%, trading at 66.39. We see gold advancing above that 5,000 level, keeping that in focus. And Bitcoin up more than 1%, hanging around that $67,000 level. Digging into some of the individual movers, we see biotech company Grail, GRAL on the ticker, tumbling for its worst day on record. That's after the early cancer detection test maker said Galleri, its multi-cancer screener, failed to meet its primary endpoint of statistically significant reduction in combined stage 3 and 4 cancer. The firm also reported earnings. We've got shares of Apple in focus rising sharply after the ruling against tariffs, reaching a session high earlier of almost $265 per share. According to Bloomberg Intelligence, Apple recognized around $3 billion in tariff charges over the past year. And lastly, shares of Walmart in focus, declining for a fourth straight day after HSBC cut its recommendation on the company to hold from buy. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nora Melinda, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Nora, thank you so much. Carol Massar, along with Emily Graffeo, in for Tim Stenovic. I got to say, we thought this morning's inflation print, which is the Fed's preferred inflation print, I thought this was going to be our top story today.
Yeah, and GDP, you know, it's a Friday in the winter. That's what people pay attention to, right?
Well, we've been like counting down all week, right, to this, and it is
you
important.
You and Tim have been counting down.
We do. Well, this is what we do at Bloomberg. We have been counting down. It is very important. And then, of course, we got the Supreme Court's rejection of President Trump's tariffs. So we want to see what our next guest has to say about all of this. Olu Sonola is head of U.S. economic research at Fitch Ratings. He's responsible for coverage of U.S. economics, and that includes the labor market, consumer spending, inflation, demographics, and so much more. He joins us here in studio. Olu, great to have you here with Emily and myself. What matters the most to you as someone who keeps a watch on the U.S. economy? Is it that Supreme Court ruling and pushback on President Trump's tariffs, who he has said he's going to find other ways to do this? Or is it all the economic growth, kind of the mixed messaging, maybe to some extent on inflation a little bit hotter than we thought and growth a little bit weaker?
Yeah, thanks, Carol, for having me. It's good to be back. I think if you had asked me this question at 10 a.m., obviously I would have said, it's the GDP print, the inflation print, particularly the inflation print, just because it was quite hot.
Yeah.
But, fast forward the last couple of hours, clearly the Supreme Court decision is very, very important. The uncertainty that it brings to the table, you can't run away from it. In as much as we thought tariff-related risks were receding, it's come right back. So, yes, the president has imposed the 10% blanket. I still have to figure out if that 10% is truly a blanket.
Right.
Or are we going to exempt pharmaceuticals? Are we going to exempt oil and gas? Which sounds to me like what they will do. But I don't know at the moment. I don't think it's clear. So when we see that executive order, we will find out.
You have in your notes that you're calling today Liberation Day 2.0. Of course, we had Liberation Day last year. It was a big market-moving day as well. You link this, though, to optimism. Are you still optimistic that this is going to be good for the U.S. economy, particularly in light of Trump floating, 10% tariffs.
No, I do think that, compared to, I would call this echoes of Liberation Day, right? Not quite seismic as Liberation Day was. The markets are not down, 10% or 5%?
Yeah, which we've been talking about feels kind of telling.
Yes, yeah. But I do think that to the extent that we have the 10%, if the administration follows through with all of the exemptions, it's going to be fine because effectively it will be lower than what we had before. If it's a blanket, that means collections will be slightly higher. So that is, I don't think most companies have planned for that.
Right.
In terms of all of a sudden I have to pay more in tariffs, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that would bring some level of uncertainty. The other point is, it's just for 150 days. What are they going to replace it with? It's most likely going to be more sector focused. So your sector focus by nature would affect some countries a lot more than others. So that brings a lot more uncertainty. It's probably going to affect pricing decisions, capex decisions, and the likes. I don't think that's what the economy needs at the moment, because this is an economy where if the government gets out of the way, the tailwinds are actually quite strong. So you have to now think, this may be a little bit negative because the economy on its own was relatively resilient.
Yeah, I want to go into that. I also just want to mention that the president did threaten 15 to 30% auto tariffs. Now I'm looking at Ford is up about 1.2%, and I think GM is little change. So it's not like it's actually up about 1/3 of 1%. Yeah, those tailwinds, if you will, whether it's higher tax refunds we get because of tax cuts, corporate tax cuts that could lead to spending. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that could be very stimulative. So that brings us to that hotter inflation print, which you, in your notes, kind of say it's our reality check. Like, we have to kind of own up that, as we've heard from the Fed or Jay Powell, right, inflationary pressures are still a thing.
They are still a thing.
It could even maybe get worse.
Yeah, it definitely could get worse. I think now with this renewed uncertainty, potentially could get worse. I think there's this wedge between CPI and PCE at the moment. The CPI print we got a few weeks ago was, 2.5%, 2.4%. Lots of people jumping up and down saying, hey, clearly disinflationary. But with this reality check, inflation is stuck at 3%. That's essentially what it is. And if you compare where we are today with headline of a year ago, it's actually accelerated.
Well, what's really kind of wild, and Mike McKee, who was breaking down the Fed minutes on Wednesday, says, they're going through, and then you get to, I think the last paragraph where it said Fed officials were wary of cutting interest rates at their January meeting, but several suggesting the central bank may need to raise rates if inflation remains high. So they are already, continuing to be very vigilant when it comes to higher inflation.
You have to be, because 3% is not 2%, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. And with all of the tariff noise, you still are not clear whether it would accelerate or not. So the Fed, given a labor market that seems to be relatively stable now, the balance of risk has shifted. It now has to be inflation, inflation, inflation.
Does this make the report we got today about growth being slower than we expected more of a blow to the economic outlook, particularly if we have the Fed raising rates in an environment where growth is slowing?
I do think that if you dig deeper, once you go under the hood, you realize that about 100 basis point or so, 1 percentage point, was because of a shutdown. If you add that back, you're talking about 2.5% growth. The economy on its own is resilient. I don't think you can take that away. And you're also going to get some payback during this quarter, right, when we get the GDP. So potentially growth could be slightly higher.
All right, you're not a political analyst, but I've got to throw midterms into this, because I have to think as the president starts to, go to different states, we've started to see some of that. He is thinking a lot about midterms and whether or not Republicans lose a lot of seats in Congress, and which would be really a vote on his White House. So having said that, do you think that will shape what he does with tariffs and policies? Because he wants an economy, right? Any president wants an economy humming along, whether it's midterms or obviously a presidential race.
I think that would be the rational view. And without me going further, anything can happen between now and the midterms, right?
Yeah.
There will be that affordability push. We're starting to see that. hopefully, if that is really, really strong, that may overwhelm the tariff noise, right? And to some degree, corporations are used to the tariff noise to some degree. So hopefully, there will not be a knee-jerk reaction from a price standpoint going forward.
How optimistic are you about the refunds for the tariffs? This morning, before Trump spoke, the question was, "Oh, okay. Well, then how are all of who's going to get the refunds, and how smoothly is that process going to go?" How are you thinking about that?
So I'm going to go from I'm not a political strategist to I'm not a lawyer, but the reality is that corporations have sued, right? They have the legal basis to ask for a refund. Now, prospectively, going forward, they may still pay tariffs, but it seems to me that they have the legal basis to ask, since it's illegal, hey, give me back my money. It doesn't belong to you. That's my sense.
Yeah, the president mentioned on the tariff refunds has to be litigated for 2 years, he said. So, this is going to be kind of interesting to see how this legally plays out. Olu, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great to have you back here. Olu Sonola, head of U.S. economic research over at Fitch Ratings, joining us right here in studio. All right, we're going to get to one of the other situations, because I feel like we've talked Supreme Court, we've talked tariffs, we've talked economic data, and then we're going to talk Iran. So we're going to get to that in just a moment.
Yes, exactly.
Should we talk markets?
Let's do markets first.
All right, let's do that. Let's get back to Nora Melinda. She's in for Charlie. Hey, Nora.
Hey, we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got stocks advancing while bonds holding losses with the dollar after President Donald Trump pledged to defend his tariff program after the Supreme Court struck it down. Speaking at the Economic Club of Dallas, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the use of Section 122 authority and quote-unquote potentially enhance Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs will mean, quote, virtually unchanged 2026 tariff revenue. Taking a look at the broader market, we see the S&P 500 up 0.6%, that NASDAQ Composite Index rising 0.8%, and the blue chip Dow Jones Industrial Average higher by 0.3%. Taking a look at the volatility, we see the VIX just above that 19 handle. And taking a look at the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, lower by about 0.1%. Digging into some of the individual movers, we see Blue Owl Capital shares are falling for the second day in a row after a decision to restrict withdrawals from one of its funds raised fresh concerns for the private credit market and sent shares of asset managers lower. And Walmart shares declining for a fourth straight day after HSBC cut the recommendation on the company to hold from buy. Apple shares rising sharply after the ruling earlier against tariffs, earlier reaching a session high of almost $265 per share. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nora Melinda, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It is indeed. All right, Nora, thank you so much. Carol Massar, along with Emily Graffeo here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. All right, so as we mentioned, we've talked about the Supreme Court decision over tariffs. We've talked about the economic data. A lot of big news coming at investors. We've got to talk, though, about Iran, because President Trump said he's considering a limited military strike on Iran, ratcheting up pressure on the regime to come to a quick deal over its nuclear program as he masses military forces in the region. We just talked with our Tony Capaccio about saying that he doesn't anticipate maybe anything coming this weekend and kind of put in perspective the forces that are there. But let's get an update on this story. And for more, we head to Alan Eyre. He's Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at Middle East Institute, and he joins us. Alan, it's good to have you here with us. Your view as you listen to what the president has said and what's coming from the White House, and as you watch what's going on in the region.
Well, first, hi, Carol. Hi, Emily. My view is it's probable we're heading for war, whether that's in a couple of days or within 10 days to 2 weeks. In terms of, as the military puts it, the table is pretty much set in terms of U.S. military assets in the region. And even though this administration hasn't given its rationale, it seems to be guided almost by inertial forces. So it seems to me there will be hostilities in the region soon.
And what's the clarity here on how Iran is preparing for a potential strike and a potential war?
Well, I think Iran has already accepted the fact that it's probable that there will be hostilities. Initially, President Trump seemed to be increasing the military threat in the hopes that Iran would exceed and agree to U.S. terms, but that didn't happen. Iran sees itself as under existential threat from the U.S. and Israel. So right now, I would assume it's preparing, and this is what satellite imagery is also showing, preparing for upcoming hostilities and planning its counterattack. And it's not going to differentiate between what the U.S. describes as a limited attack and any other type of attack. Iran has messaged that if it's attacked, it will respond aggressively.
Is Iran right that it's under kind of an existential threat at this point?
Well, I think each side is misperceiving the other. As I said, I think President Trump's administration thinks that the more force it shows, the more likely Iran is willing to capitulate, whereas Iran, which sees itself as in an existential struggle with the U.S. and Israel, sees any capitulation on its own red lines as merely an invitation to further aggression from the United States. So we're in a very different place in the relationship than we've been for most of the decades I've been following it, where even though neither side prefers military aggression, both sides are prepared for it.
So what are the next 10 to 15 days going to look like? That's the timeline President Trump has given Iran for how they could avoid potential military action. And how optimistic are you that the two countries could avoid military action?
Well, they certainly could if they wanted to. I mean, unfortunately, neither side has really pursued vigorous, sustained diplomacy. There's a certain inertial momentum here because there's so much distrust between the two sides that there's a type of sort of strategic path dependency. There's certainly room for negotiated settlement. President Trump's red line is he doesn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. That's certainly doable in terms of verification measures, restrictions on the Iranian nuclear program. But due to the total absence of mutual trust and the gathering of military forces in the region, at this point, as I said, it seems overwhelmingly probable that there will be military action. So I'm quite pessimistic that they'll be able to avoid some type of military action. And once that happens, prediction is impossible. I don't know the target set that Iran will seek to move against once if the U.S. attacks. It could be U.S. forces in the region, U.S. allies in the region, Israel, and we don't know how extensive initial U.S. strikes will be, whether they'll try to decapitate the regime in hopes of accelerating regime change or something more limited.
Alan, what about what's happening at home in Iran? I mean, we are reporting notes, a professor at Johns Hopkins University who says, Iran may not have much reason to agree to a deal now, might be counting on the idea that a U.S. attack will rally nationalist support for the regime at a time when it's faced pressure internally from weeks of protests. He went on to say that there's a little the U.S. has offered that Iran could agree to. So I do think about also there's what they're dealing with the U.S., but also what they're dealing with at home in terms of protests.
Quite correct. There seem to be at least some in the Trump administration who hope that an aggressive attack on the Iranian regime will jumpstart some type of regime change that will result in a more pro-Western, user-friendly regime in Iran. I don't see that happening. There's no institutions in place that could replace the power vacuum that would be left behind, even if the Iranian institutions were successfully decimated by a U.S. military strike. And that's a huge if. So what Iranians are preparing to do, there's no generalization I can make.
Yeah.
There will be possibly some rally around the flag effect, and others hoping that the U.S. finishes the job it starts and puts in some other type of regime.
Just to wrap up here, tell us what we need to be watching for just right in the near term here about any signals you're going to be looking for any clarity on how Iran is preparing for a potential strike.
Well, we know how they're preparing. They're trying to reinforce their facilities that they think are strategically important in terms of nuclear sites, in terms of missile sites, because what Iran is banking on is the ability to respond using its missile forces, using its drone forces, using its rocket forces, both against land targets and also against targets in the Persian Gulf, because the Persian Gulf is a very small area, very shallow, There's a lot of U.S. naval assets there. The Iranians traditionally have used swarm techniques with small Iranian craft.
Right.
So the next thing to watch for is, unfortunately, initiate hostilities.
All right. That makes sense and pretty black and white there. Hey, Alan, thank you so much. Alan Eyre, Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute in D.C. As we head to a break, we've got stocks higher across the board. We've been bouncing around, but we are seeing some gains, certainly the S&P higher as well.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, Friday, but it's a busy Friday. That's for sure. Carol Massar along with Emily Graffeo in for Tim Stenivek. Just a quick check on the trade as we speak. S&P 500, just off our best levels of the session, up about 0.5%. You've got the Dow, if you care, up about 0.25 percentage point. I hate to say that because when I started out, you cared about the Dow, but we don't.
Now it's only 30 companies.
All right. Sometimes it matters.
Yields moving as well. We have treasuries up, especially in the front end of the curve, that 2-year up 2.5 basis points. Watching that area now, we have economic data, the tariff data, how that's going to impact, the treasury's budget and such.
Well, I think what we're hearing, a consensus among some of the conversations that we just had, and I feel like that we've all been having, is that inflation is still a thing. We got that with the Fed minutes. So you can expect that, right? Maybe there's not going to be Fed cuts coming. Maybe they're not going to even leave rates alone. Maybe there could be Fed increases. And so that speaks to a higher rate market, right? And a higher U.S. Treasury curve.
Yeah, I haven't heard anyone say the S word, stagflation, yet.
No, we were go back, I'm trying to think, is it a year? There was a point where we were talking about it a lot.
Yeah, and today we got that weaker economic data, but, hotter than expected inflation. You think maybe some people will start bringing it up. And then we can say that Emily was the one who...
Emily was the one. All right, we'll give her credit.
That term. All right. Let's take a look at some stocks on the move. I'm Emily Graffeo, jumping ahead of Carol Massar here. And we're joined by Bloomberg News cross-asset reporter Denitsa Sikova. Okay, let's go to retailers.
Yeah, we're talking about uncertainty in the economy, and what a better place to start than Walmart. Walmart had a pretty rough day yesterday, and today it's down about 2%. The ticker, of course, is WMT. The firm forecasted less earnings growth than analysts were expecting. Of course, we know Walmart is always on the conservative sides when it comes to earnings estimates, but still we're seeing some concerns because even HSBC cut their recommendation for the retailer from buy to hold. So clearly analysts are taking this seriously. What is happening is obviously the economy is expanding at a fast pace, but there aren't too many jobs being added. So clearly that K-shaped recovery, or whatever you call it, is definitely weighing on the company. The number everyone is worried about is they expect earnings to rise from $2.75 to $2.85, and the street was actually expecting nearly $3. So pretty big gap that clearly is worrying investors. The stock is up more than 9% year to date. So needless to say, there is just kind of a short-term thing.
It's also been on a tear. I mean, up more than, 70% in 2024, up about 23% last year.
For sure.
And
it's coming from a very strong rally.
Well, and I think a lot of people like what they've been doing, right, in terms of some of the shifts and a lot of stress on digital.
Digital has been a big revenue for
e-commerce,
them. One of the fastest growing parts of the business, for sure.
All right, I've never ordered anything from Walmart, though.
Yeah.
But just think, Amazon.
I wouldn't think of it, yeah.
Right?
You said Amazon, but Amazon has actually displaced Walmart as the company with the largest revenue today. So it was Walmart, but now it's Amazon.
But does that include AWS?
I think so.
Yeah. It's not apples to apples.
It's not
like retail to retail. I've been looking at that story.
It's a big moment.
All right. My understanding is Walmart is still the biggest physical retailer, like physical store retailer.
That makes a lot of sense.
Like there's a distinction, right? All right, Amazon.
Okay,
I'm
Amazon.
just kidding. I was thinking about, we're going to go somewhere, but I was thinking about your credit world.
Yes.
Have you been talking a lot about Blue Owl?
Yes, that's been the big focus right now. And in fact, it's one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal for today. It might even hit the most read for the week as well, as we're closing out the week. But so much focus here on private credit and what it means for retail getting into private credit. Tell us about Blue Owl stock. This is interesting because we get a public look into how this sector is performing.
Yeah, for sure. BDCs, it's something we've been looking for
Business
quite some
development.
time. There was the whole conversation about cockroaches, but what we're seeing now is a lot of the funds that kind of appeared in the last few years, the whole exposure to retail. There's like evergreen funds, interval funds. There's just like a slew of vehicles that now allow retail investors to access the space are under pressure, and Blue Owl is the example that is happening this week. The ticker is OWL. The stock is down about 6% now. Year to date, it's down 27%. And it's not only Blue Owl, we have Eyre, we have Apollo, we have Blackstone, KKR. All those names in the private credit and private equity space are under a lot of pressure. What happened is there was a decision to restrict withdrawals from one of its private credit funds. And of course, those withdrawals were already quarterly. It's not like this is not an ETF, you cannot just go and withdraw your money. But now there is more and more pressure, and clearly investors are very jittery about down 27% year to date, and everyone has been looking for cracks when it comes to private credit, and fundraising has been really slowing down for private credit. So in terms of what's happening in the future, we're definitely seeing investor worry.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there. Denitsa, thank you so much. Bloomberg News cross-asset reporter Denitsa Sikova joining us with Stocks on the Move. Check out our 5-minute episodes of Stocks on the Move, biggest winners and losers in the market. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Right now, Emily Graffeo, we are looking at a market. Yeah, we've been bouncing around a little bit, but we're up across the board, up about 0.5% on the S&P 500. You've got a NASDAQ 100 that's up about 0.7%. And we're going to continue talking tariffs, the economy, and so much more in the next couple of hours.
It's going to be a good show, Carol.
Yeah, actually, we have got the lead plaintiff in the case that the Supreme Court just weighed in when it comes to President Trump's tariffs. So looking forward to that. That tops off our 3 o'clock hour. Coming up next, The Close.